This is the We Witches 3 podcast, where you will hear the opinion of 3 seasoned witches who are tired of glossy, tunnel vision, love and light accolades about serious metaphysical topics. Your host, Charlene, Maria Sewell, and Heather Woodworth have been practicing witches and professional psychics for over 20 years. They not only have the experience, but they have the research to back it up. So get comfortable on your brooms, grab a snack, and get ready for a wild ride. Hello, everybody. Today we'll be interviewing Courtney Weber, author of The Morrigan, Celtic Goddess of Magic and Might.
Hi, Courtney. So first off, let's launch into, I love kind of your superhero origin story, like how you met the Morrigan and how you got pulled into the relationship with her. Would you like to relate that real quick for everybody? Because I think it's a fantastic story.
Yeah, so I'll go back a little bit to tell more about my whole background. I've been, oh God, how old am I now? So I've been a practicing witch for almost 20 years, and was very early in my practice was pulled into more deity-centered witchcraft, which means that you have a specific god or goddess, or maybe a handful of them that you may consider your patroness, that you pray to, that help guide your life. This is not the way everybody does witchcraft, but it was a very easy, natural fit for me, especially given that I grew up in a Catholic and Southern Baptist home where God and the saints were very much part of life. And so it was easy for me to embrace the different deities. My primary goddess remains Bridget. I've been a priestess of Bridget for a little over 10 years now. Wow, anniversary just happened. And thank you. I should buy myself a cake or something. And her.
Yes.
And what I don't mention in the book is how I travel a lot for work. And a lot of times when I travel, I will go to the local metaphysical bookstore and I'll pop in and I'll talk to the shop owner and ask, what are people looking for and what are people not getting? And one of the things they said is they could use more books on the Morrigan. Now, I want to make it very clear, there are already a lot of really great books out there on the Morrigan, but perhaps their patrons have already read them and we're looking for something else. Or sometimes a shop is more aligned with one publisher than another, so they're not getting as many. So make that very clear. Mine is not the first, nor is it the only one out there. And I also heard from my publisher that anything about goddesses, especially Celtic goddesses, was something that was still very much a draw. And I actually started talking about this to a friend of mine about potentially writing a book about the Morrigan. And the first thing she said was, no, don't do it, because it's really going to be hard and scary and people are going to hate it. And I said, okay, now you've just given me every reason why I should write this book. Because I'm a giant masochist. And so it came at a really, also I'll go back. There are a lot of rumors that were circling around the Morrigan, and one of which is that she will bring bad things into your life. She'll bring illness and death and loss and terrible things, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people veer away from her. But there's a lot of, I kept hearing that she was calling to a lot of folks. And I was curious about that. I was curious about why this goddess of death and warfare and, as some would say, really, really intense sexuality would draw so many people. And then some people found a lot of comfort in her. And what I found was not that the Morrigan brought some tough things in my life, but that she was a very natural fit for me while I was going through a lot of really painful things myself. I just left New York City and moved back to Oregon, where I grew up. I had a very successful coven in New York City for 9 years and was running one of the largest pagan communities in the Northeast region. And I was really getting to a point where I was burned out and had lost a lot of the magic in my life. And when we moved out to Oregon, all of my magic supplies were boxed up, and I purposely brought only the things that could not be replaced in my suitcase. And so the rest of them sat in the moving truck for 3 weeks. And when I got to our apartment, they didn't allow any candles or incense. So I truly didn't have any of my standard magical tools available to me. And I needed to start from scratch. At the same time, I hit a pretty bad space of depression. I've been ignoring my own depression for a number of years, and then an eating disorder I've been battling for most of my life just snuck back up and was starting to take over. And, my husband and I had a number of issues with infertility, and we just kept hitting one dead end after another. And I was just feeling really emotionally and spiritually exhausted. And in that case, sometimes it's like when things are just so shitty, you just want to sit down with a person who has seen the worst of everything and have a shot of whiskey. You're not necessarily looking for comfort. You're not necessarily looking for someone to solve your problems. It's like, I can't be around anyone right now who's going to focus on the happiness and joy in life. I want someone who is really, really well acquainted with the pain. And I just want to sit with them for a while. And then Morgan was like, I gotcha. What do you like to drink? So
Totally.
Yeah. And I just on a professional level, one of the things that drew me to her was a curiosity around who she might be in the middle. So there's been almost a kind of dogma that follows the Morgan, or has in recent years, of just an almost orthodox sticking to certain texts and being very rigid about interpretations of the Morgan and that kind of thing. And that if it's not absolutely verbatim for what the oldest and most ancient text has she was listed, then it should be discarded. Now, there's reason for that. One is that for a long time, up until very recently, things that were written about Celtic deities, Irish deities in particular, were very watered down, and their rough parts were often smoothed over to be more palatable, especially to American audiences. We really like our Disney endings and we like our Disney characters, and so there's a sense of watering these deities down. Yeah, which is intuitively being like, I know that's not true. I want the true story, and also out of respect for the fact that a lot of this shaping these Irish deities was done by people who weren't Irish, right? And so there's a sense of reclaiming that wanted to happen. So I want to say I understand and respect that concern and sensitivity. At the same time, I felt like that people were afraid to approach the Morgan as though, like, I'm going to do this wrong, so I shouldn't even bother, even though they were feeling her call to them. And so I felt like there might be a middle path there, because I am someone who wants to find out the original sources. I do want to get to the best the best original interpretations. I don't like the watered down versions. I don't want the Disney version, I should say, of these myths. But at the same time, I also believe that the gods evolve as we do. One of the analogies I make in the book is that the old Celtic spirit is definitely alive in Ireland. When you go and visit and you talk to the people and you just even be on that land, you feel that antiquity of thousands of years of tradition. At the same time, nobody should show up at their bed and breakfast in Galway and expect that their B&B owner is going to meet them with an iron sword and take them on a cattle raid. Okay, that's right. That's right. That's not how the people operate anymore. And so I believe the gods have evolved too. So I think there's room to make room for what a lot of people say unique personal gnosis, at the same time honoring and respecting the original sources that it came from. So I wanted to offer a middle road that way.
Now, if I can interrupt you a little bit. Yeah. One thing that you already mentioned that has been driving me crazy, and I've seen this everywhere in pretty much every discussion of the Morrigan, online and offline, is how scary, harsh, and mean she is. Now, I personally, like you had mentioned already, not everybody works with the gods in a very personal way, and I do not. But I do work with ravens and crows and other corvids across traditions. So I've had kind of a tangential relationship with the Morrigan through my entire practice. And this whole reputation she has of being scary and mean and harsh seems very overdramatic. And that's one of the things that you address in the book.
Yeah, so if I could say there's one thing that the Morrigan is the goddess of, people say she's the goddess of war, she's the goddess of death, she's the goddess of ravens. You got to look at it in context for the people of the age that first coined these myths. So the Irish Celts were at war a lot. Their lives were much shorter than lives are today, which is probably the case in most parts of the world. And Ireland's weather conditions can be very harsh and extreme. And now, of course, with technology, that doesn't have the great impact that it once did. But the entire Irish Celtic economy was based on warfare, specifically cattle raiding. So we're not talking like Braveheart style wars that were like hundreds of people going at each other. It might be like half a dozen people fight over the course of the afternoon, and whichever side wins, they get all the cattle. Right. So to me, it felt like, okay, is this goddess a goddess of warfare, or is she a goddess of uncomfortable facets of life that are unavoidable? And so that to me, I once said to, actually to somebody when I was in Ireland, I talked to a woman, I said, I feel like she's the goddess of the United States election cycle. It's never ending. It's uncomfortable, but you can't avoid it. It's just part of life. And this woman said, yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, she is the goddess of things that are scary and uncomfortable. But to me, I would say that she is a goddess that knows how to navigate those parts of life that are uncomfortable, that are scary, and that are also unavoidable.
We're kind of like the goddess of Monday morning.
The goddess of Monday morning, the goddess of taxes, and I would say right now the goddess of trolls. The goddess of trolls. She's the goddess of dealing with trolls on social media, because if you're going to put yourself on social media, you're going to deal with that. So I think that saying that she's scary and a goddess of terrible things, it may just be a misunderstanding of the circumstances of the people who first understood her and worshipped her.
And this also seems like this her being the goddess of things that are scary also seems like a desire by the witchy, new age, and spiritual communities to really want to whitewash the spirituality, and our witchcraft and paganism. We really want to focus on things that are rainbows and unicorns and nurturing and love and all that kind of stuff. Would you talk about when you discuss her as an earth goddess and a fertility goddess?
Yeah. I think there's two things going on. Christopher Penzak quoted to me something that I've just loved ever since then. He's like, there's white lighters and then there's dark fluffers. And they're the same. They're the same kind of people. So you get some people that are completely hooked on everything being happy and joyful all the time. And you get some people who are completely hooked on everything being dark and scary all the time. So I think sometimes people talking about her being dark and scary is they want her to be that way, because they want to have a goddess who's really dark and scary. And to me, both gods and magic, there's so many nuances. It's always like, yes, but in what context, in what situation, is what I always ask. Okay, it's light and happy for whom? And it's dark and scary, again, when or for whom? So, but yes, you're exactly right. So the word Morrigan has a couple of different translations, one of which is called the Great Queen, or the Phantom Queen, or the Queen of Nightmares. And if we're looking at her as the Great Queen, we have to remember that the Celts, or the Irish Celts in particular, often saw the land itself as a female being that they might call the Great Queen. I mean, Bridget's name comes from the term the Exalted One, which in some interpretations is believed that that was the land of Eastern Ireland. That was considered like the Exalted Lady was the land they stand in, whereas in other parts of Ireland, the land might be called the Great Queen. And so that's more of a title. The Morrigan has been adopted. And like you guys mentioned in the beginning that I'm from Oregon. When you live in the Pacific Northwest, you're very aware that nature is beautiful and can grant you incredible vineyards and make some of the best wine in the country, along with legal marijuana, and provide all these wonderful, delicious things. Y'all should come visit. At the same time, when my husband moved out here, I'm telling the story and he'll probably be embarrassed, and I apologize in advance, but we moved out here and we were out biking, and he said, that mountain there, that's a volcano? I said, yep. And he said, well, what happens if it blows up? I said, we die. But it hasn't blown up in about 20 years. So it's probably not going to blow up today. And he's like, oh, okay. And so we keep on biking, and we're smelling a lot of smoke, and we see a sign that says, road closed up ahead, forest fires. He's like, should we turn around? I said, no. The fires are 50 miles from here. That's precaution. Let's keep going. Well, it turns out the fires were 8 miles away. And if the wind had blown a different direction, we could have been in a lot of trouble. So I was like, oh, honey, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, we were in a kind of a dangerous spot with that. And then whenever we go to the coast, the first thing we do is look for our tsunami evacuation route. And my husband said, so what do we do if there's a tsunami? I said, well, I'm glad you have good shoes on, because we're going to run up that hill as fast as we can and wait for the helicopters to come. And he said, well, what do we do with the car? I said, we say goodbye to the car, and we hope that everybody else said goodbye to their car, and we get up that hill as fast as we can. And then about a week later, there's an earthquake in Mexico. We share the same plate as Mexico. It's been like overdue for Oregon to have a major earthquake. There's a reason why the natives didn't build a lot of structures out here, is because they knew they wouldn't last. And I said, so honey, we need to talk about what to do during an earthquake. Where you're sitting is the worst place to be in the house. And he was like, oh my God, the state, I can't deal with it. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, the land is giving and generous, but she will also kill you in an instant, and she doesn't care. And so that the earth can be very, very dangerous. Or, for the world of the Celts, in which lives were absolutely tied to the land being fertile, Ireland is a very fertile country, but also one of the many reasons why the potato blight happened, which assisted the genocide over there, was because they call it the year without a summer, and it just rained all summer and it was cold. And so the crops failed. And so that's something that can happen. And so there is a sense of the earth goddess could be a very punishing, very cruel force as well. It's something that I live with. And it's certainly something that the Celts live with.
We had a recent podcast that we titled it "It's the End of the World," and we discussed that Maria lives over in Florida where the hurricanes happen, and Heather and I are in California too, same plate as you. So it's just kind of like, it's the end of the world, same as it ever was.
Yeah, we both react similar to like both disasters. When it's a hurricane, they're freaking out over like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "It's just rain. It's really windy. We're fine."
Yeah.
And then there's an earthquake over there, and I'm like, "Oh my God, are you guys okay?" And they're like, whatever. Something fell off the shelf.
Yeah, it was actually very funny. Last summer, we had a lot of problems with fires out here. And that was the same week that there was one of the hurricanes last summer was going toward my friend in Florida. And I messaged her and said, "Hey, are you guys okay?" She goes, "We're fine. Are you okay?" I'm like, "We're fine." I'm like, "Do you want to come out here?" And she's like, "No." "Why don't you guys come here?" I said, "Yeah, no."
Yeah, we were having the exact same conversations. Like, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, we're fine. Are you okay?" Like, oh, yeah, the earth does what it does. The land does its thing, and we adapt accordingly, and it's been doing the same cycles and the same kind of things for as long as it's been around, and to not recognize that, I guess, would be foolhardy.
Yeah, for sure.
To somehow think that this era of humankind is exempt is weird.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that vein, I don't think people should take such events so personally. Like the gods are out to get them or something.
Well, the truth is that gave us some of the great myths of time, is the feeling that the goddess is punishing us personally, or that this is the end of the world. Right. And the whole book of Revelations was about the Emperor Nero, and it felt like he was going to destroy the world. Right. And people kept going, which is funny that I'm now saying, let's look to the book of Revelations as inspiration for getting through this really dark political time ourselves.
But that's the point. People thought the world was going to end, but it didn't.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We're still here. But yeah, so it's interesting to me, going back to your book, that you talk about all these different aspects of the Morrigan. And I do like that you opened that so early in the book, that you were like, yes, people think of her as terrifying, but she needn't be. But you also touch on the fact that the gods evolve with us, that they're not frozen as of 1000 BCE.
Yeah. Yeah.
That it's 2019 and they've been evolving too.
I mean, they are reflections of human experience. So they're going to embrace and embody that which we do, for better or for worse. And so that means in some ways the gods have gotten kinder, but you could also say the gods have gotten crueler too. You look at Christianity, and there was a time in which the god was considered to be very kind. And you look at some of the major evangelicals now and some of the things that they're saying, and you're thinking this god has become very cruel.
Absolutely. Of course, then again, if you look at preachers across Christianity, it's not like they all agree.
Yeah, that's true.
No, it absolutely is not true. But it's you're looking at patterns and things like that.
Yeah, it is an interesting phenomenon, but and I think we see that in pagan practice as well, though, that people have disagreements across
most
different
definitely
traditions.
Yeah.
About the same gods. So like all belief systems that involve the Morrigan aren't telling the same things.
Mm-hmm.
No, and that's very true.
And I love that one thing that you do throughout the book is that you relate the myths as they're told in pieces and parts, and then you say, this can be interpreted this way, or this can be interpreted that way, or sometimes this can be interpreted that way. We can't know what it was meant to mean.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, some of the myths from this era are very confusing, and I know I struggled a lot with understanding the myths. And why is it everybody dies at the end of every Irish myth? It felt like.
Yeah.
And I talked to a friend about it, an Irish priestess, and she said that she felt like the myths were a lesson on what not to do. Like, don't do this, kids, because this bad thing will happen if you do. And then it helped make a lot of sense to me. It's like you need to honor your contracts with the land. A lot of stories that involve one of the goddesses associated with the Morrigan, Bive, that the Bive would often appear to kings and say, you know, you're really screwing up, and if you don't change your ways, you're dead. Now, these were men, and did they listen to her?
No, of course not.
Of course not. And then what happens?
Probably wouldn't hear about it if they did.
Yeah, that's right. And what happens at the end? Everybody died. So there's a sense, and there's also, she was a representative of the earth goddess, and another one of these symbols of being really terrifying, and she would often be having blood running out of her mouth, or she would have garlands of gore or intestines wrapped around her. She's running around and naked and screaming and, you know, terrifying these men. But it's also to remember that the kings of the era were believed to essentially marry the land. And if there was something, if the crops failed that year, or if the weather was not on the side of them during a cattle raid and they weren't able to raid the cattle, and it looked like, you know, people weren't doing all that well, there was often a thought that the king had broken one of his taboos, because when the king married the land, he would make a series of promises and would be under a number of restrictions. And so there'd be the sense of, we got to get rid of this king because the land is no longer accepting him, right? And so it's important to think about, again, thinking about what these myths meant to those people in general. I feel like today, and it's also, it's like, what do these myths mean for us now? And the stories of the Bive remind me so much of politicians and climate scientists, because I feel like climate scientists are our modern Bives. They are speaking up to power and authority, saying, you are, Greta Thunberg could be considered a manifestation of the Bive, because she is speaking out to power, saying, you are screwing up. If you don't change your ways, we are all doomed. And people often want to shut down these kind of voices, just as the kings and his soldiers in these myths wanted to shut down the Bive, right? And climate scientists are often subjected to death threats, and the way that we've seen people treating Greta and these other young activists who are speaking out against destruction of the environment. And it's the same thing over and over again, that we don't want to listen to the voices that are scary. We don't want to listen to our modern Bives, which is science and youth and young women who are speaking out, and the people in power don't want to hear it. So I'm saying this with a smile on my face, because I actually feel hopeful that we're finding this kind of attraction toward goddesses like the Morrigan, because it gives us an opportunity to pull insight from these myths that are so terrifying. Because it's like, let's not stop at being scared. Let's push through the scare and see what's on the other side. And that was one of the first things I learned from the Morrigan, is that, okay, I'm acknowledging that I'm scared and I'm proceeding anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives kind of like a hope that there is some kind of end. Like, it might not be a rainbows and sunshine kind of end, but there is an end to it. And then things do come back to rights one way or another.
Yeah.
You know, like, there might be like a terrible tragedy befalling a kingdom for a bit, but then things get back to where they were after like 100 years or something.
You get a new king.
Exactly. Then you get a new king, and eventually people move back into the devastated land, and they repopulate it. Things get back to where they were, or better, whatever.
And then they've learned. Then most importantly, they've learned from the mistakes of the people who came before.
Yes. Yeah, and that's, I don't know, a better kind of hope, but hope nonetheless. You know, like, maybe this round of people don't figure it out, but the next ones will.
Let's hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, going back to like what we know of the Celtic Irish or the Irish Celts, one way or another, we don't have like a lot of primary sources on exactly what the historical. So we're using a lot of like secondary and tertiary sources, and that's a whole frustrating process, isn't it?
It is a frustrating process, and remembering that the Celts in general did not keep written texts. And it's not that they didn't have writing. You have stones and monuments that have Ogham script, which kind of looks a little bit like runes, but they did not keep texts of their myths in the way that, say, the Romans did about their gods and goddesses. And that was by design. Celts generally believed that memorizing your stories was a better practice for your mind. And potentially the thought was, a text can be destroyed, but a story cannot.
Good point.
So, so a lot of these stories were written down by Christian monks in the 4th or 5th centuries, and that's long after Ireland had become largely a Christian country. I mean, it was probably still many of the old pagan practices were going on for a while, but institutionally speaking, it was definitely a Christian country by that point. And writing these things down back then was still a very expensive process in order to spare the parchment and the ink and also the time of the people that were writing this text down. In order for the church to spare that kind of labor and resources, these myths would either needed to be coded as some kind of mythological history, or they would need to have some kind of Christian bent to them at the end. Some of the myths sound very much like Noah's Ark. Sometimes you randomly will read stories in which some of like the Israelites might get inserted in one way or another. And then there's one story of Cuchulainn, the Irish hero, where he's fighting, he's almost to the end of the story, and then the heavens open up and Jesus comes down and everybody's saved. And you're like, what?
Yeah, that seems weird.
Yeah, it's a little weird, and it's because it was a Christian monk writing it down. And likely in order for him, and it was a him, to preserve these stories, he's got to be like, well, if the bishop comes in and sees that I didn't make this a Christian story, he's going to destroy this. I at least got to give it a different ending. So there can be some frustration there, but it's also just, we got to remember that's the culture that they had at the time, using the resources and opportunities that they did.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting, the whole like facet of the oral tradition and then the supremacy of the written word, which still kind of like the supremacy in quotes, the supremacy of the written word, and then like thinking about the sudden and rapid rise in podcasting, because you mentioned that you have a podcast of your own.
I do.
The like sudden rapid popularity of podcasting today kind of feels like a return to that oral tradition.
I think there's certainly something to that. And I think also part of it is we've become so increasingly isolated from others that having a podcast on makes you feel like you've got that connection and communication. I know for me, I started listening to podcasts constantly when I started working from home about 2 years ago. So I spend most of my days alone. So I constantly have podcasts on, and then eventually was like, well, I want my own. And so I want one.
Oh, and just for the sake of mentioning it, what's the name of your podcast?
It's called That Witch Life.
Oh, I love that title.
Life? Yeah, it's with, I started it with my 2 oldest best friends. And so, because it's funny because all 3 of us ended up finding our witchy selves at different times and in different ways. And then we all, moved back to Portland or Portland area about the same time and said, let's start a podcast. And it's super fun. So we get some great guests on there, but we also just, like you all do, talk about being a witch and what that means in today's world.
Oh, how fun.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
So circling back, like, how do you see people interacting with the Morrigan in modern, like, what does a modern Morrigan practice look like?
It's really, like any goddess, it's very diverse. I do think that the Morrigan attracts an unusually high number of people who might identify as activists or involved in some sort of social justice. I think that there's a nature for her fighting for the right side, which really appeals to people who have that sort of spirit. She does draw a lot of queer people and a lot of people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming. It may be because she would often embrace roles that were more traditionally, she was identified as female. She would often take on men's roles. So there's a sense of not conforming to one's assigned gender that I think it attracts a lot of people. Now I feel like I'm talking about, like, I sound like Gandalf. I feel like there is a
You shall not pass.
are looking for more ring bearers and and people that will fight the good fight. I mean, right now we're just looking at what the Supreme Court is discussing this very day as we're recording this podcast. There's just a lot of work to be done, and I think people have in general felt very powerless in many ways, and so there's certainly an attraction to a goddess with as much power as she has, not just power of the self, but power to make change. Oh my God, my cat is walking on my keyboard. Ah!
Yeah, that's okay.
You can leave that in if you want.
Hello, kitty. What's his name?
Bear. He's a big black cat we rescued a couple of years ago. So.
Oh.
And he's a hungry boy. Get off my keyboard. Okay.
And you had mentioned that in part of your Morrigan practice, you yourself were doing activist work.
Yes.
And the resolution of which took like a freaking year.
But for good reason.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, for the hurricane that ends up happening, I believe, right?
Yeah. So it was interesting, and I'll go out and I was part of the Occupy movement when it was happening in New York City, and I still have a lot of mixed feelings about that whole experiment and experience. But it was funny. It seemed like the Morrigan told me it was coming before it did, and because they kept having this recurring dream of being trapped in her cave in Roscommon in Uudnagat, otherwise known as the Cave of the Cats. I wasn't sure what that was about, why I kept having that recurring dream, and it was a really terrifying nightmare. And then I was recruited to be a chaplain in Occupy Wall Street, which was a really interesting role to have. I was working with a number of young Christians who were trying to help, and a lot of the Christians would be shut out by the other occupiers, saying that organized was religion and was one of the things that had caused so much inequality, and that they themselves were a part of the problem. But when they would ask, I say, hi, I'm a chaplain, I'm here to help. And they'd say, what's your denomination? I'd say, well, I'm a Wiccan. The person would stop and pause and give me a hug and say, okay, I can talk to you. You're somebody I'm glad to have your help and glad to assist with that.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was an interesting place. And again, I feel like when the gods actually pull you into some work, I don't trust people who say, I'm doing God's work. I don't trust those people. Mm-hmm. But I'm more inclined to trust people that say, I don't know what the hell I'm doing here, but I can't seem to leave until it's done.
Right.
And I feel like those are the people who actually probably have, to quote the Blues Brothers, a real mission from God.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. And so I thought that was part of what said, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I feel like there's a purpose for it. And then Hurricane Sandy hit the city a couple of weeks later, honestly, after the camp was disbanded. And the news turned to the election so quickly when that was going on that I don't think most of the nation knew exactly what was going on in New York City. We were without power for quite a while, but also we were without gasoline. So there were no buses. There was no subway. There were some cabs, but not many. And so it was having to walk 5 miles to work, get there, and not even sure if your coworkers are coming in because they're either stuck somewhere or they're not alive. Mm-hmm. And also, for the first few days after the storm, the Red Cross, as people who live in Florida know, Red Cross takes a couple days to show up. FEMA takes a couple days to show up. It's not instantaneous. And so you've got a couple of days where people don't have water and don't have paper towels or diapers or things like that. But Occupy Wall Street had a lot of that stuff. There was bottled water. There were diapers. There were paper towels. There were people who were trained in first aid. There were lots of flashlights. People could walk up these 17-story buildings without power. So no elevator in order to check on people. And because we were so organized, we were able to get to help people a lot faster. I was really sick during that time because one of the things that also hit New York was this really awful lung crud. So I was stuck with a fever and I couldn't talk, but I was able to organize supplies to people. So I feel like that Occupy was the training ground for the real war to come. The Morgan, she's often talked about as being a war goddess, and she's often depicted with weapons. Her weapons are strategy and also voice. So she's able to use her voice to summon kings to rise and fight. But she's also about planning, like when she meets with her husband at the river and says, all right, I want you to go here. I'm going to go here. I'm going to take him out there. And you guys are going to go back this way and do this. Or when she's strategizing with Lou, she's like, what I shall follow, I shall chase. Whole plan for how she's going to pursue the enemy. She's a goddess of strategy, I would say, even more than warfare. And so that's one of the battles I felt like she was. Maybe she sent me there just so that I could write this book and help people recognize that kind of strategy energy when it came up. So I don't want to go so far as to saying I feel like the Morgan was on the side of the occupiers, because I really don't know that she takes a side, but I do think that she was helping me to help find my strategizing spirit and my warrior spirit to help out my community when it was hit by a storm. And part of that preparation was being an Occupy.
Right, like maybe they were part of the resources for the hurricane later.
Yeah, exactly. I think as many faults as Occupy I really do believe that Occupy has saved lives in the end in its relief efforts in Sandy in the weeks after the storm.
Okay, so my question is, being that in the historical documents aren't necessarily accurate to the myths and what they really were meant to say or what have you, because it wasn't necessarily written down, do you think that if they were to have been written down more, I guess you could say, accurately to the myths of what they really were at the time, do you think that Morgan would not be seen as so much as a horrible or like scary war goddess, but seen more maybe like the Greek version of like Athena, which is more war and wisdom, where it's more like strategy and all that stuff? Because you just said that she would be more of a strategist.
Right. Well, I'm sure that there are plenty more stories, or were more stories of the Morgan in which she was pretty boring or even kind and generous, because it's the sensational stories were the ones that were preserved. And it may have been, again, going back to thinking about what the Christian monks would have had in mind when they were writing down specific stories. And one of them might have been that they don't want to show the goddesses as sweet or kind or lovely. They don't want to, that would be considered blasphemous to their faith, and so it would be more acceptable, or perhaps more in line with their own faith, to make her look more demonic, because that's in their faith. That's what that would have been. Anything that wasn't God or Jesus would have been considered very evil. So it would have made sense. Those are the ones that they want to preserve, of her being really horrifying and scary. Or it might have been those were just more interesting, right? I mean, it's simple as that. So I'm sure that there were plenty more stories in which she's just walking along and she plucks a flower and sniffs it and then gives it to a child. I'm sure that there were stories like that, because if you look at any of the more preserved canons of mythology, indigenous gods or goddesses, they have a very wide variety, and sometimes they're really sweet and gentle, and sometimes they're throwing temper tantrums. Sometimes they're getting drunk. Sometimes they're feeding the poor. Sometimes they're crying because their husband cheated on them. Sometimes they're falling in love. It's a very wide array of who these beings were, and we just have such narrow windows into the gods of the Celts because of what the people that wrote them down chose to preserve.
Yeah, absolutely. You had mentioned you tied the Morgan to the Banshee, and what you just said reminded me of that, because it always confused me growing up that the Banshee was so vilified, but it always seemed like she was trying to be so helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
It's and I don't even, it's almost, to me, it's like, I don't know. I don't personally think the Banshee is either helpful or hurtful. I think she just is, and she is a sign of things to come. She is a symptom of what's going to come. There will be weeping and wailing. And so she's like, hey, guess what? Weeping and wailing's on the way. Like it or not, here it comes. And I think that there's also the question about, like, but it's funny because even just the other day, I was on the phone with a good friend of mine, and we're talking about Lizzo, and like, I'm 100% that bitch. And she said, you should get you should get a shirt that says I'm 100% that Banshee. And I said, oh no, I don't want to attract that energy. Like, automatically I was like, no.
Well, there are a lot of fan shirts that say 100% that witch. So
yeah,
that's
yeah,
close.
yeah, it's close. But I was just like, no, 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 I don't. I am not. I'm not calling that to me. I am not doing it. So yeah,
Yes. Well, I view a heads up as being helpful. At least, like if you're gonna,
Yeah.
if I'm gonna
It
have a
makes
hard time, a heads up is nice.
it helps. I felt like because one of the stories I told in the book, and I hope this is okay for your listeners. We're giving a trigger warning. This is a very disturbing story. So, and you probably read this one in the book, is that while I wouldn't call this a visit from the banshee itself, the banshee has a very specific apparition of of being the older woman or the woman in red who's screaming. And mine was a dream in which someone looked at me and said, "Death is near." And I woke up really shaken by the dream. And I mean, I've had prophetic dreams most of my life. I'm at a point where I can often tell which one's a prophetic dream and which one's, a indigestion of my subconscious. And this one, I was like, this is real. And I actually reached out to a friend and said, I just want you to know I've had this dream. So when I come back and say it's come true, I'm not making this up. And she's like, you got it. And then a few days later, I was staying in a hotel and I woke up suddenly. It was like 2:30 in the morning. Something woke me up and I didn't know where I was and I was super disoriented. And I went back and finally said, okay, I remember my city. I'm going back to sleep. But then when I woke up 7 or whatever, there were all these police officers and news reporters in the lobby of the hotel. And right at the moment I'd woken up, a woman had shot her husband and her 2 children before turning the gun on herself in that hotel, just a few floors
Oh,
below.
wow.
Yeah. So I realized, okay, I had a premonition and it came true. And so it helped me, I think having the whole experience was very jarring. It helped me center myself. And then I actually, by trying to avoid the onslaught of people in the lobby, I found myself actually face to face with one of the victims because I was in the back of the hotel. And all of a sudden, I find more cops, and they're stopping me. And out comes a gurney where the body was covered, but with the person I later found out was her husband. And so I was the only civilian there, and I offered a prayer for his soul. And so it's like perhaps this led me to this spot that someone needs to witness this,
Mm-hmm.
he'll play the role of pastor. And although I didn't know what his faith was, I could say, look, I know you're probably not a Wiccan, but I'm gonna offer to you what I can, and ask the Morrigan if she could spirit his soul away as painlessly as she did to Cuchulainn when he died. In some ways, it felt to me like he might have been a Cuchulainn in his own way, because it turns out when I'm reading the stories later, his wife suffered from terrible mental illness, and he tried to help her, and ultimately it took both of their lives. And so I thought about Cuchulainn trying so valiantly and fighting a battle that just could not be won. So there might have been a reason for me being there. I think if I had not had that dream and at least something in my consciousness to prepare myself, I don't know that I could have been centered enough to not only be present for this person who had just passed away, but in a very, terrifying way, but also then be present and grounded for the work I had to do, which was support a group of ministers who were there for a conference. And they were shaken up too, but you know what? Snacks need to get put out. Supplies needed to be ordered, hotel bills needed to get paid, that kind of stuff had to get done. And somebody had to stay grounded, and that person had to be me. And
Wow.
I think if I'd not, like I said, if I'd not had that vision, I don't think I could have gone into that space and be ready for that.
Wow, that's really intense.
Yeah. So
That's incredible. Yeah. That's absolutely amazing. Now, just to kind of switch gears, you offer a lot of really amazing exercises and rituals, and then there's a whole section on spell work. And just the intimacy, I guess, is the word I want for the rituals, especially in getting to know the various aspects of the Morrigan. They were really touching, I guess, is the word I want.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're really beautiful. And I love how throughout the book you did, especially like for the exercises and stuff, you very clearly reached out to other practitioners.
Yeah, that was something that was given to me in the beginning, because I sat down with a number of priestesses of the Morrigan and said, what are you looking for in the book? And one of the people I actually interviewed for this book she says, I know the lore, I know the history, I've got lots of books on that, and there are a lot of excellent books out there that are straight up Morrigan lore, and I can't recommend them enough. And she said, I just want something that will help me connect with her on a very in my life and in my time. And so I interviewed a number of people of different ages, a number of people that are from Ireland, and people that here in the United States or in Canada, that some of them have Irish ancestry, others don't have any Irish ancestry at all. So it was a sense of, and it just incredible stories about things that are as beautiful as feeling like the Morrigan helped a woman transition out of her PhD program into being a doctor, and or helping someone who figured out that they were trans and it was time for them to embrace their true gender, or how she helped a friend of mine figure out that she needed to leave her husband. Right. And then sometimes it's just or things that are not quite as traumatic but are still painful, like letting go of the pain because of solution of a friendship, stuff that's really real. Not everything has to be super dramatic to have an impact. Right. And so having those stories in there, I felt were really, really important, and helping people connect with a goddess that, like you said, is sometimes people surround her with, she's dark and scary and dark and scary. And it's like, yeah, and there are other things that she's about.
I really found the section, and the fact that each chapter ends with like a personal story from someone else about their relationship, like you just mentioned, from all different demographics. And I was especially shocked that you had a story from someone who had just left high school.
Yeah.
And I know, like, as a young person in the pagan community, in the New Age community, I was so invalidated in my practice by everybody else that when I read that, I was like, that's pretty fucking epic.
Oh, I had lunch with this person when I was at Temple Fest. They were talking about the Morrigan. They said, oh, but with the Morrigan, there's this divine madness. And I just looked at them and I said, can we talk a little more? Because that was fucking brilliant. And they were like, you want to talk to me? I said, yes. I said, you can bring a friend if you want, but let's go back and let's have a talk. And they let me interview them about their experience with being fresh out of high school and being queer. I love that they felt like sometimes the Morrigan came to them as a drag queen.
Like, I love that.
I loved that. I was like, yes, of course. Why not? I could totally see that. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually, I blogged about this not too long ago, that I think that Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, is one of the great unsung witchcraft movies.
I love that movie so much.
So much. It's so good. When they finally came out on Netflix, I watched it like 3 times in a row, back to back.
Oh, that's fantastic. But yeah, the experiences you draw from all walks of life in the book, like, it was really touching, and just the way that you bring the personal relationship with the Morrigan into it, because so much of what you read is very impersonal and so very cautionary that it's very frustrating.
Yeah. It can be, and there's a mix for everyone. Some people find a lot of connection in the very more stricter academic resources, and some are going to find that mine's too academic, and they're going to want something that's all experiential, right? So again, I'm offering a middle path. I'm going to offer some of both. I wanted my book to be all purpose. I wanted people to read the myths as close as they were to the original as possible, but in a voice that was a little more accessible. Sometimes reading this older or middle English is a little tough, but reading it in trying to put it in vernacular that would be easy and gentle to read. But I do encourage people to, if you are interested in the Morrigan, to read everything about her, read all the interpretations, read the original stuff, read different translations. That's also very important, is the different translations are going to give you a very, very different look on things. So yeah, that's also another thing too, is who translated the myth out of the Old Irish. That's a big deal.
Yeah, we had that discussion with someone else, like, who translates things and how many languages they went through before they got to English, like, really, really matters.
Yeah, embrace it all. There's so much. And then I think as you'll go along, you might find that somebody has been a little too liberal with the translation or the interpretation. It might not be someone you want to return to. But I definitely say read the old myths and then see what they have to tell you about your life. You may read my interpretations and find that none of those fit in what you're seeing, and embrace what the goddess is telling you in that moment about what in that moment that you're seeing it.
Absolutely. Now, I also appreciate that you have been pronouncing so many of these words throughout this interview because I had no clue how to say them.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad. Well, I was messaging one of my very, very best friends, born and raised in Ireland, and I was like, I need your help. Can you say all these words? And I recorded her saying them, so I've been practicing. But even then she goes, you know what? Some of these are beyond me too, because these are tough.
Yeah, I say them in my head, and then I hear you say them, and I'm like, yeah, I wasn't close.
Yeah,
I wasn't close enough.
It's okay. I'm probably going to be off a little bit too. I mean, when I do my presentation, I try to say more of the words. I go, oh God, here it comes. Native Irish speakers, forgive me. I'm going to dive in and it's going to be bad.
Actually, what's of the two Morgans? It's the Morgan sisters. What's the Machi?
Maca.
Maca. Okay,
Maca.
see, I read Machi.
Yeah, so the ones that are the most frequently associated with the Morgan. And again, for some people that are not as familiar, the Morgan may have actually been a title for a collection of goddesses and not just one goddess with different facets. But Bive, Maca, and Morrigu are sometimes known as the Morgan.
Yeah, so those D like always gets me every time.
But yeah, that's often when you see the D and the B, it's often a very soft fa, like a V. But yeah, that's Irish is a very beautifully complex language that trips a lot of non-native speakers up. So don't feel bad.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that we also got to learn a lot about other goddesses as well.
Mm-hmm.
If I try to say their names, I'm going to mispronounce them and then embarrass myself terribly. So that's my disclaimer before I actually do the thing. Like Anu and Danu and some of the other whose names I just mispronounced completely. But some of the other goddesses as well. And that was really...
I might be making a mistake with some of these as well, but there's Naaman and Fea, but I might be mispronouncing those. So I apologize to native speakers out there. I am trying.
Yeah, I'm trying as well. But so for instance, I am not that familiar with the Celtic pantheon at all. I only know like the mainstream gods and goddesses, but several of those I hadn't even heard of at all. Naaman and Fea I hadn't heard of. And so this was a really good like kind of way to wade into that deeper mythology for me.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing to people to remember is that the Celts covered almost all of Europe, including the British, what is now the British Isles and Ireland, and they were even in some areas of Turkey and northern Italy. So sometimes now what we have inherited from this time is the sense of gods and goddesses that seem very different from one another, but that's because the gods and goddesses that people were worshiping in Wales were likely very different than the ones that were in Ireland. Even though they're close to one another, it's not like they were talking every day. Sometimes you find some similarities. These people weren't cloistered from one another. They did travel, they did get around. But I personally would not assume that the gods that are being worshipped in Ireland or the people that are worshiping gods in Ireland are going to be wholly aware of the gods that are being worshipped in Gaul or what is now France, which is also part of the Celtic world. And so there's a tendency, I think, to want to interchange a lot of them. And I can understand that to a point, but it's really not accurate. And I think it can be very confusing. I mean, there's even some that believe that Ireland shouldn't be called Celtic at all. It itself was far too different from the rest of the Celtic world to really be considered of that culture. I'm not making a choice there. I am referred to the culture of Ireland at that time as Celtic because that was the era. I make that very clear with Morgan being called a Celtic goddess and saying she's purely Irish and not associated with other Celtic goddesses in the mainland. People are going to have to decide for themselves how they feel about that. But yeah, there was probably the Roman explorers documented at least 400 different deities in the Celtic world. Right. And so
good God. But it's probably like different tribes, right? The different tribes had their own.
Absolutely. Different tribes, different languages, different religious customs. The only two things that modern archaeologists really used to codify the entire Celtic world were the use of iron in their swords in particular, and the burial rites, the funeral rites. Aside from those things, the Celtic world was very different from one another depending on where you were. It's kind of like the United States now, right? You certainly wouldn't say that the culture of people in Western Oregon is going to be like the culture of people in Central South Dakota. Yeah, there's going to be some similarities, and certainly most of us speak the same language. but there's going to be some pretty stark differences. So you imagine going back a couple thousand years where people aren't communicating as much and aren't traveling as much, although the Celts did get around. They weren't isolated peoples whatsoever, but the common people probably didn't leave far from their own home. You're going to have very, very different approaches to religion and the world. Even in, the Greek world, I'm doing a book on Hecate now, and learning about the different ways that the ancients honored her among other deities in different parts of Southern Europe. So yeah. Very, very different.
I was going to say, I've been known to complain about how people mistake the Norse for being a homogenous culture, and they make the mistake of thinking Celts are a homogenous culture, and they make the mistake of thinking the Greeks are even a homogenous culture, and they covered a much smaller area.
Well, yeah, the Greeks traveled so much. I mean, even in Pompeii, the ruins of Pompeii, they found ruins of Celtic people that were down there. They were travelers, or they were immigrants that were living in Pompeii, and they identified them based on their clothing and possibly other physical characteristics. But it's not like these people weren't aware of one another. I mean, the Celts got their technology for ironwork. They got it from the Chinese. China was the first culture to develop the forge and the anvil. And that technology ended up in the Celtic world somehow. So it wasn't like it was two simultaneous inventions. They likely got it from either they were traveling and trading with the people of what is now China, or vice versa.
Right. But homogeny, like, that is a huge fallacy that we tend to want to believe, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
To me, it's thinly masked racism looking for a kind of cultural purity.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And trying to come together with some sort of identity, like this is mine and this is pure. And it's like, there's nothing pure about any culture in any part of the world, with the, being mindful of appropriation and not, especially if you come from a more colonizing culture, being respectful of that. But I especially think, especially among cultures that traditionally have colonized others, it's really unfortunate and painful when you hear about gatekeeping around issues of purity. So
yeah.
I get it quite often because I'm not Norse or have any kind of Norse blood, but my patron gods are Norse gods. I get that a lot. I was like, well, what, like, do you have any lineage? And I'm like, no. Why do I need it? Like, who gives a shit?
Yeah. It's this kind of lineage thing can be a really tricky thing to navigate. And there's, been more talk lately that even if you have Irish, your ancestors might have been Irish, it's not fair to call yourself Irish because you didn't grow up there, which is true. At the same time, when I'm talking to friends of mine, particularly those who are African American, where so much all lineage was stolen away, and then when they get a DNA test done, it's like, oh, I'm 40% Irish. This is part of my culture, and it's like, well, in that case, celebrate that you found your lineage. But I feel like for me, as a white lady, grew up in the United States, my family's been here 300 years. You look at me, everyone's like, oh, you're freaking Irish. And when I had my DNA, and all my Irish friends were like, you're freaking Irish. And I said, well, I don't know. I've also got a lot of Eastern European. My parents got their DNA test done. They're both half Irish, and went, well, I guess about half Irish. But I don't claim that as like a birthright. I think that's important to remember, is that I grew up here. And there's privilege, and there's also responsibility, and being mindful and respectful that I may have some DNA ties to Ireland, but I don't have a right to claim Ireland or Irish myths as my own. So I'm still a foreigner when I go there, and I make that very clear in my book. I'm a foreigner writing about a foreign country that has been very generous with me, and I am forever thankful.
Right. There's a big difference between, like, ancestry and heritage.
Yes.
And so that's something I think a lot of people struggle with, and it's a good conversation to have. So, but I do think that that's very evident in the way that you've written the book, especially, like, there's a lot of respect towards Ireland and the people of Ireland who live there, and the way they continue to live their lives, both the ancient peoples and the modern peoples who are in 2019. Like, we don't treat the Irish like they're still tribal folks running around.
Yeah, and it's also, I think there's something I would love to encourage more Americans to be careful about, is when you go to sacred sites or when you travel and go on a heritage or ancestry tour, it's wonderful that you're reconnecting. I mean, celebrate the fact that you're reconnecting, but remember that this these aren't for you to take. This isn't for your taking. There's been a lot of problems that have happened with trees over in Ireland, thorn trees or fairy trees, where people are leaving lots of offerings on them, and very well-meaning in many cases, but the trees are getting overburdened with some of these offerings, especially ones with metal chains, or people are actually sticking pins into thorn trees and killing them. Yeah, and it's meant to be like, oh, I want to give this. My intention's good. Yes, Karen, your intention is great, and we're so thankful. But then it's like, if all these tourists are coming over and like loading down these trees, then they're dying. Then first of all, it's robbing the future of the chance to see them and visit them, but it's also robbing the people who it is their heritage, it is their birthright, really, that they're no longer able to make offerings at those trees because, or the people got to put gates up or something like that, and have a local person unlock them, and that's, it blocks access. The local people want to celebrate their heritage, and so maybe Americans, when you go over, contribute by collecting garbage, make that your offering. Sing a song to the trees, give water, those kinds of things.
Or biodegradable stuff.
Milk.
Be careful. Milk, because those people pour milk on the trees, and that's caused fungus, which has killed trees as well from milk offerings. So
exactly.
Yeah. So it's
milk and dishes.
Pardon?
Milk in dishes only.
Yeah, just like milk and dishes, or one of my last trips to Ireland, my husband and I went with a friend of ours to a fairy mound that had a really beautiful but just heartbreaking story, and we climbed on top, and we had our whiskey with us. We made our offering of whiskey. And then as we're trying to climb down, we couldn't find our way back to the main path. And we ended up stumbling, and the three of us rolled down the hill to the base of it and ended up in a ditch that was full of garbage. And to me, it was very clear. The fairies were like, that's very kind of you, bring whiskey. What we really could use is some people getting rid of this garbage. And so that was our really great offering, was cleaning up the trash there. And another thing I did is I helped remove coins. People were sticking coins in the thorn trees. I was removing those, and this was at Tara Hill, and I took the coins up to the donation bucket and left them as a donation sacred site. I certainly didn't keep the coins, but one of my gifts was, I'm going to help get rid of some of this stuff.
I did notice in your book that you specify, like, if you're going to be putting things on the trees, you use organic fibers only, no metal chain, keep the milk in containers, and remove it once it curdles. And, there was very specific, like, don't put coins in the tree, don't put pins in the tree, don't put chains around the branches, like, no inorganic fibers, because that will strangle the branches. Like, that was a really great guide to see in there. Like, yes, you can put your devotions in trees, but please don't kill it.
Yeah, and a friend of mine who's an initiate in Ocha, she says that the greatest offering to the gods is pure water. And I feel that may be universal, right?
Yes.
I would say maybe bring some water, or sing a song to the tree as an offering. That's a beautiful offering to make.
I think we forget about service too. And I think singing is a type of service. Like
exactly.
Singing or orating, like telling a story, or, cleaning up, or, those kinds of things, like in service kind of things.
Yeah. Actually, in Santeria, one of the things that people do as an offering is just turn on the radio.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. What a wonderful gift.
Yeah. They literally just turn on the radio, and they just say, like, here's some music for some time to entertain you, for you to like. Here you go. And they'll just turn on, like, music. And it's not like traditional, like, Afro-Caribbean type music in the sense of, like, tribal stuff. It's just like regular music that you would hear on the radio. It's not anything,
Lizzo music is an offering.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge Lizzo fan. I'm all for that. It's an offering to anybody. So we should probably wrap this up. Heather's been telling us to be mindful of our time.
Yeah.
So where can people find you? What are your other books? And what did you say the book you're working on right now is?
It's called Hecate, Goddess of the Witches.
Nice.
That sounds amazing. She's very in right now.
Yeah, it's weird. It's so funny. I'm saying this out loud. Maybe it'll help me get through it. Is that It's a very different kind of book that I've not written before. I mean, the way it's coming through, it's almost like an autobiography of becoming a witch. Very different than like the Morrigan, which was a lot about look to the lore and find the inspiration. Hecate is like look to yourself and there you'll find. It's very different.
Ooh.
So I'm trying to give myself more permission to follow that lead. So thank you, ladies, for hearing me as I'm working through that creative block of mine. Like, this isn't like my last book. I'm like, no, it's not.
No,
So,
that's amazing. We don't want each book to be the same.
No, I mean, we don't want the books to be the same. So yeah, I have a couple other books out right now. One is, my first one was Bridget, History, Mystery, and Magic of the Celtic Goddess. Similar vein to the Morrigan, looking at the different myths, looking at the Celtic history and understanding her more that way. And then I have another one called Tarot for One, The Art of Reading for Yourself, which is exactly what it sounds like. Reading tarot for yourself is really challenging, but I have a lot of tools in there to help you bond with your own tarot deck uniquely and then get out of the way of the question of, am I only seeing what I want to see? So
a lot of people struggle with that. There's that whole, a friend of mine used the word stupidstition the other day.
Oh yeah.
About how you can't read for yourself. It's impossible.
It's not true. And so then, and then the Morrigan, Celtic Goddess of Magic and Might, officially releases on November 1st, but I understand some people who pre-ordered are already getting their copies. Find me on my website, CourtneyAWeber.com. That's 1B, not 2. And I'm going to be speaking in a number of different places. I'm going to be in Arizona on November 1st and 2nd, in Utah November 3rd and 4th. I'll be in New York on November 14th, and then back here in Portland on the 15th and 23rd. And I will be in Walnut Creek, California in December. And then in January, up in Spokane, Washington. I'm also co-leading a creators retreat in the San Juan Islands in Washington in February. This is for people of all genders who are working on books or, music or pieces of art. Sometimes you need to, as a creator, go on a retreat, but we're going to be offering a number of rituals and meditations to help break through creative blocks, rituals that are inspired by the Morrigan and Bridget. And a portion of the proceeds, both from my books, but also from this retreat, go to an organization called Resurrecting Monuments, which is a group of Irish archaeologists that are working to preserve the sacred sites and also bring home the remains of Irish people who have passed away overseas so they can be buried in their native land. So letting people know that supporting these things of mine also support the sources that the inspiration came from.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Awesome. Don't forget my podcast, That Witch. We're on Spotify and on iTunes and all that kind of stuff. Me and my two best friends running our mouths and occasionally saying something smart about witchcraft, but mostly running our mouths. Yeah.
And we will include all those links in the show notes. So if people are not checking our show notes, you really should, you guys. We put a lot of links in there. So you don't have to use Google to find this stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. And this was an amazing conversation. We loved the book. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it was great.
It just, and all the rituals and the spell chapter and the mythologies and all the references you put in the back, it's an amazing resource and absolutely recommend it to people who are looking to learn more about the Morrigan.
Well, thank you both very much. I, started listening to your podcast recently and I just love it. And I was delighted that you invited me to be on it. And let's keep in touch. Let's do this again.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're looking forward to Hecate.
All right. Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. For show notes and links, just go to wewitches3.com. And don't forget to check our Patreon at patreon.com/wewitches3.